Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event on Finance as a History of Speculation. My name is Chui, and I'm director of the UCL Centre for Ethics and Law. This is the research centre that's bringing you the event today. With me today is the main speaker of the event and an eminent discussant. Our speaker today is Dr. Daniele D'Alvia, and he's lecturer in banking and finance law at the Centre for Commercial Law Studies at Queen Mary University of London. Today's talk is based on his forthcoming book, which is called The Speculator of Financial Markets: How Financial Innovation and Supervision Made the Modern World. Very interesting perspective from the lens of the speculator and how financial regulation and markets have evolved till today. This is a very interesting historical and philosophical account, of which the Centre heartily endorses. Dr. D'Alvia is also Associate Research Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies and Associate Researcher at the European Banking Institute. We have invited an eminent discussant today to give his thoughts and comments on this interesting book, and he is Professor Andreas Rahmatian at the University of Glasgow. Andreas is Professor of Commercial Law, and he has a wide range of interests spanning intellectual property law, commercial law, intellectual history, and the law. And his most recent book is A Critical Legal Theory of Money. So the order of proceedings today will be that Daniele will regale us with the key insights of his book for about 20 minutes, and Andreas will provide a commentary for 10 to 15 minutes. After which, I'll let Daniele have a very brief moment of response to the commentary, and we'll address audiences' questions towards the end of the webinar. However, at any point in time, I urge members of the audience to field their questions through the Q&A function in the webinar. I'll be looking at the questions, and if there are too many of them, we'll select the most salient and interesting ones to be addressed at the Q&A function. So we hope to address everybody's questions, but there is no guarantee in terms of the limits of our time today. However, we hope that you enjoy the webinar, and please keep the questions coming through the Q&A function. I'll now give the floor to Daniele.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Professor Chui, for this kind invitation, and to UCL. It is an honor for me to be here and for having me. I will start probably by saying how the idea of this book came up. I started my PhD actually in London when I was around 26 years old. Today I'm 37. At the time when I look up on Google and I type special purpose acquisition companies, the result on Google, there were only 6 or 7, 10, no more than 10 probably. Then, notwithstanding this, I wanted still to research this topic, and so I was fortunate actually to be supervised by Professor Michel Everson at Birkbeck University of London, and that is where I wrote in law. Of course, in economics there were already some papers or PhDs, but I started to write the first PhD in law on special purpose acquisition companies. By the end of that PhD in 2020, there was a big phenomenon in the US where SPACs, they hit the jackpot in some way, and we started to have more than 80 billion in proceeds. So the results on Google from 10, they started to be over 1 million. And still today, it is the same. What is going to change is that for sure, the regulator, that is the Security and Exchange Commission, was very aware of the criticalities of financial innovation and the criticalities of SPACs in particular. And so they came up with a reform. This reform still today is not approved, but it is a very critical reform because essentially this reform is going to change in case 100 years of history of securities laws in the US. From that point of view, I started to understand that financial innovation matters. So I started to understand that probably they were always with us But what probably we didn't have so far was a book that could speak to the audience and to readers, professors, professionals, lawyers, but also supervisors and people working with the regulator. What is the perspective of a speculator? Because many books, they speak about financial regulation in objective terms. So they say those are the rules, or sometimes if we look at Silicon Valley Bank and the financial crisis, I mean, that happened in March 2023. So the March Madness, now it has been denominated in this way, the March Madness. Is something that, I mean, reminds us the importance of regulation, and also the fact that once we want to regulate more, sometimes we might even kill financial innovation. So there is this kind of contrast in financial markets. On the one hand, we want to regulate, but on the other hand, if we regulate too much, we can kill financial innovation. So this book tries to look from the point of view of the speculator, so from the point of view of the people that they make financial markets work, and so how financial markets they move. To do this, I wanted to take a perspective that, as Professor Chui said, is focused on a sociological aspect of financial markets, but also philosophical aspect and economical aspect. So there are a little bit a mix of different subjects within the book. And in fact, the book is starting by introducing the reader to the concept of risk. To do this, actually, I use a symbol. This symbol actually, although it seems a little bit strange, it is Lucifer. So why I choose Lucifer to start my book? I start with something that seems quite dark, because actually the history of speculation is an history of darkness. So it's an history that starts from a point of view of the human being that is thrown to the world, and in the world is going to take decision and is going to take risk. The history of Lucifer is also reminding us in some way that he was, of course, a character of rebellion. So in reality, every time in the book I give some historical account where I show essentially that speculators they started to take risk, and they started to do this to bet against God. So in reality, the fact that you take risk is something that can be a little bit against God. Why? Because for a long time in Europe, the Catholic Church was dominating the scene. And actually, under the Catholic Church rules, usury was not consented. I mean, it was a sin. From this kind of thinking and doctrine, we started to have financial innovation. So if we think, for example, in chapter 2, I'm speaking about the Medici family in Florence and the Bill of Exchange. So the Bill of Exchange is a big financial innovation in order, in some way, to find a loophole against usury. So to still try to lend money and to move money around. Although you cannot charge interest, but you can take maybe fees. So financial innovation are always a product of financial markets that they will try to, in some way, use if there is a loophole, and in some way, I mean, take advantage of the market. But it is not something new. It's something that actually then even developed after the Medici, if we think about all the money lenders that they were in Florence. And for example, in that case, they were Jewish. And the book actually is also defending Jewish communities by that time, because actually I had the pleasure to be in contact with the Warburg family, that they were the direct descendant of a Jewish family in Venice from Banchi Rossi, that was the Red Bench, where money lenders, they were actually by the time in the 15th century conducting their business. And essentially there I discovered that interest is not true that was charged only to Christians. It was charged also to Jewish. So it's still possible, and this is something that actually under et risca, that is a specific instrument in Jewish law, still today in Israel, if there is a contract, a specific agreement between Jewish, you can still charge interest. So it's something that probably this book is also opening our eyes that sometimes we had a lot of misconception in financial history, and this is just one. I moved then in the book in, for example, chapter 3 to speak about the origin of the corporation. And that is also where I start to speak about other types of financial innovation. The corporation, for sure, I mean, the company is one of the main important products in financial markets, because without a company, we cannot make business. And actually, in particular, if we think about public companies today, the ancestor actually of public company is in the 17th century, the VOC, that is the East India United Company in Amsterdam by the time. That was the example of the first public company on the market. And actually, in the book, I also say that this type of first public company in reality gave rise to the first public market. So in reality, the first Amsterdam Stock Exchange was created in Amsterdam, not by chance, is because actually the directors of the company, they needed to pay dividends, and those dividends usually, of course, as today, are paid in cash. But because cash in reality is something that is not always simple to obtain, even by the time. So in reality, if we see now Silicon Valley Bank, they lack cash, but even at that time they lack cash. And so they started to pay investor by spices. And so because not everyone wanted spices, the investors, they started to trade shares in a market, in a real market. And then this market became a financial market. From that moment, then I start to connect this first financial market to the rise of all the other physical exchanges that are in New York Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange, and both, for example, the history of London Stock Exchange and New York Stock Exchange, they share a vision together, because actually they both were created from coffee houses. So from informal places, we can create something that is formal. But then still, in reality, we just create a physical place, but we don't have rules. So rules is something that then are key and are important. In fact, the book is taking into account this, especially in the chapter 3. I also speak about at some point the rise of new financial innovations, especially even after Wall Street crash in 1929, like the rise of the hedge funds and the special purpose acquisition company, that actually is a new financial product, but still something that, as I define in this first chapter, is an old new portrait of the speculator of financial markets. Is new, but also old. Old because a special purpose acquisition company that today, for example, we know in 2020, is very well connected to the spirit of the company, of the corporation, to venture beyond. So, for example, a SPAC does not know the target company. And even by that time, if we think the VOC in the 17th century, they didn't know how to go in the route in Asia in order to explore route for spices. But still investors, they invested in that company. So this kind of spirit has always been present. One thing for sure that I understood and learned from this book is that there is nothing new. Is that at the end of the day, financial markets in one form or another have always existed. I think also, and I understood that actually speculation can occur on anything, can even occur on commodities, can even occur on art, so alternative investments. So everything can be something on which you can speculate, because if there is a demand for it, and then you can resell at higher value, you can always speculate. Then, speaking always about financial markets, of course, as you know, there were the big division at some point between the bull and the bearer. So in reality, people that they bet on the value of a stock, and so they buy at 10 and they resell at 20. so that are more on the bull, and then the bearer that they really believe and they want to be a short seller at some point, so they believe that the value of the stock of today can collapse tomorrow, and so they can make an advantage of the market. And this is something that in modern forms, for sure, chapter 3 is showing that born more once there is a physical exchange like New York Stock Exchange, and then the evolution with NASDAQ, that is 1970s and so on. But for sure, the book has also some hints on a very old past, like 2000 years ago. I am from Rome, so this is my city where I was born. And in fact, Romans, they had their own physical exchange that was the forum. So still today, if you go in Rome, there is the forum. Of course, it's not all built because in over 2000 years, the majority is destroyed, but still there are some columns. And there, from old sources, we can understand that actually there were speculators. But the speculators and the idea of the speculators was always negative. In some way, they were those that they were taking advantage of the market. So all of this brought me then to chapter 4 to understand why there is this idea about speculators, why they have this bad image in some way. In some way, they have this because they are those that they deal with uncertainty. They are those that in reality, they have an intuition that cannot be defined. It's an intuition that is part of their subjective belief. For example, to explain this, I speak about Keynes. Keynes was saying and was comparing financial markets to a beauty contest. So he was saying that actually the judges, they don't select the most beautiful girl, but they are going to second guess the opinion of the other judges. So at the end of the day, the same thing happens in financial markets, where the investors, they second guess the opinions of other investors. It means that the value of that financial asset will never be fair, will always be maybe overpriced. And this is very clear, especially in this last financial innovation that, for example, is a special purpose acquisition companies. But sometimes they overvalued a target company, and then this target company, the actual value of the target company was maybe close to zero. So this is why financial regulation is key. It's key in order to prevent this misconception in financial markets, in order to make also transaction clear and transparent. And this is something that is good. The part that financial regulation, and I claim in the book, is not able probably to do is the fact to regulate the subjective belief of the speculator. So the speculator, in fact, chapter 4 especially, is speaking about this division risk and uncertainty. So in risk, we can calculate actually risk, and I engage with Frank Knight, but I give you also an history, how we could come along the law of probability, because the law of probability and statistics is not something that born in one day. It's a process that took centuries. And then among all the thinkers, we had even Pascal, for example, and by that time, the law of probabilities was created. And with the law of probability, I can calculate more or less how much risk I'm going to take. But I don't know, for example, 100% accuracy, I cannot have it. So I can say that maybe 80% of time, my bet on financial markets will be correct, but that 20% of time is uncertainty. So it's still uncertain. And so that is something that already is part of the system. But in addition to this, let's say in a simple way, people are crazy. So people, they can also buy a stock just because they are driven by their emotions. And so for this reason, how financial regulation and a financial regulator can cope or deal with that subjective aspect. This is maybe a preliminary form of answer why we still have financial crisis. Because although and despite all the regulation that we can put in place, we cannot, let's say, understand and identify that subjective belief in advance, and so prevent it. It's not possible to prevent. So chapter 4 is for sure a chapter where I speak about this in a very philosophical way, but also with some insight from financial history and economics. And the last chapters, just to conclude, essentially, they are speaking about the economic bubbles. So in reality, they are speaking about what is going to happen when this speculator actually is taking too much risk on the financial market. And this happening things that actually are old and new, because if we think about Gregor MacGregor in Scotland in the past, and then the scandal that he started to make in London, essentially like a sort of Ponzi scheme where he was selling bond of a country that didn't even exist. This is something, this type of behavior is something that is not so different from what we see today in FTX, for example. So the chapter 5 that is on economic bubbles is speaking also about this recent phenomenon that is digitalization, that is cryptocurrencies, this new idea of money, but something that in reality cannot challenge the main idea of finance that is and will always rest on traditional banking. My conclusions now, also to conclude my speech, let's say, once I started with the image of Lucifer, of course, I started with an image of darkness. And the last image of the book, in reality, is an image of God. So in reality, this is also why I'm speaking about here, I mean, today, in reality, I speak about ethics during the end. I speak about ethics because I think that in reality, speculators and so human beings, to be correct, they don't really need at that point financial regulation. They should be ethical first. So they should take ethical decision, and maybe only ethics as an answer can then save a speculator from damnation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for regaling us with the key perspectives in your book. And I would definitely like to ask you shortly later on whether you agree that financiers are doing God's work, quoting a very famous financier who said that before the global financial crisis unraveled. On that note, shall I give the floor over to Andreas for your commentary, please, Andreas?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Iris. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to read Daniele's book before everybody else could read it. And it was most fascinating. Essentially, it's a history of financial markets in a way with a purpose, with a thesis, which I come back to in a moment. But just sort of to run through this, you have got stories, essentially, and that's also one of the reasons why it reads well. It's something which is not necessarily addressed to, you know, a specialist in financial regulation or in perhaps money or banking or something. It can actually be read by everyone, really, which I think is a very good thing, because it is, I mean, perhaps not the dumb person, but a lay person who is clever enough would actually be able to make sense of it and probably find it quite enjoyable. On top of it, which is something which, after all, is a book on sort of quite technical finance, pretty unusual. I mean, this is actually a great achievement. Now, if we look at chapter 2, and Daniele has actually gone through that, but I give a few sort of headers to give you an idea what's in there. So you basically have stories of, you know, examples, really. So, for example, we have got the lending business in ancient Rome. We have got the Christian prohibition of money, going back to the church fathers, Augustinus and so on, Thomas Aquinas, all these things. People, I mean, I knew that, but I think it's not so common that, you know, you have got that sort of concentrate together in a book and find it, and can then probably do further research on that basis. Then I've got the issue of the Bank of the Knight Templars, the question of the interest prohibition, the relationship between Jews and Christians, a very important thing, because of course the whole story about Jews could take interest and so on had a very anti-Semitic overtone in the history, and so one has to be very careful, and Daniele actually works it out how that really was. So this is also very interesting. We have got them in the third chapter is history of joint stock companies when they started, the Dutch East India Company, the making or the creation of the Bank of England in 1694, and things of that sort. The stock exchanges, which started in coffee houses, I mean, also the clearing houses were basically coffee houses, and people would actually meet there, and then you could change the checks where to actually get them to and which to the paying bank and on the collecting bank, and that's how it started. So I mean, coming from Vienna, why would I say anything against it? I mean, it's quite obvious. And then the chapter 4 is probably the most interesting one in the sense of a sort of a more Daniele has said philosophical, but one can also say theoretical approach to the whole story. What is the speculator really doing? And he goes then into the history of numbers as well, Fibonacci and so on. He then also mentions Pacioli, the father, or at least supposed father of the modern form of double entry bookkeeping or Venetian bookkeeping, which is actually also quite interesting, not only because the merchants did it, also the bankers did it already, the Renaissance, and also the making of bank money can actually already detected in Pacioli's original texts in some ways. So this is also a quite interesting aspect to it. And then also the question of probability. Cardano, who was a gambler, and so he had to find some ways to actually make sense of it. Not only a mathematician. And then, of course, Fermat and Pascal. What I didn't find is Louis Bachelier, who is actually the father of modern financial mathematics in 1900, which is actually the basis of the whole thing. But of course, this is also one name among many. And then, of course, game theory with von Neumann, John Nash, famous or infamous, whatever you want to see him, and so on and so forth. And the good thing is it's all together anyway. I mean, you may say, well, I want to have more. Well, then go to the footnotes and then see more. But it's a very good way of getting this all together. And then you have got the idea of classical economics, where you have measurable and predictable approaches, which I don't think is actually quite right. Because the neoclassicals have that as well, or at least they believe that they have it with the marginal utility. It just doesn't quite work. What is, however, both in classical and neoclassical economists have something which is sort of disappeared really with the physicists, even with the theory of relativity and quantum physics, is that idea of certainty. The economists have a mindset which is very much late enlightenment. You can actually predict everything ultimately. You can actually calculate everything ultimately. You have got rational human beings ultimately. Of course, you've got then all sorts of side people who question exactly that. But this is sort of the idea. That's what you learn in basic macroeconomics. And I learned that as well, because in our law degree in Vienna, we had to do economics, whether you wanted it or not. It was a compulsory subject. And so this is my later revenge, as it were. But it is actually, of course, very useful. And the Austrian economists were all lawyers. It's always forgotten. Hayek was a lawyer, Mises was a lawyer, all these people, and it shows very much in their approach, even today. I mean, you can see that quite clearly. And then in the chapter 5, you have got the speculator's role in financial crisis. And this is actually a disaster story, one after another, also quite nicely sort of summarized, but it is not anything which makes speculator really particularly lovable. And then you have chapter 6, sort of the other side, the speculator who benefits from the crushing of markets and markets going down, the bear market, and therefore the short sellers who actually want to live, and the sellers in derivatives who actually want to make a profit out of the fact of the going down of the prices. And so this is what you get. And then you've got the thesis, which is at the beginning. And this is what I actually referred to already at the start of my talk. Speculation can be seen as a kind of rebellion. The uncertainty actually makes people free. There's certainly this religious aspect to it that, only God knows the future. You are not supposed to. You find that with the Christians and the Muslims alike, and there are the prohibitions of insurance and all these kind of things. interest as well. So people who have free themselves by taking risks, this is one idea. And speculation leads also to creativity, progress, and financial innovation. And progress in another way as well, also very much late Enlightenment, particularly Scottish Enlightenment. Investment leads to riches because you will actually invent new things. People will actually have less hunger and so on. Lord Keynes wrote that, Adam Smith wrote that, and they desperately needed it in the late 18th century because Scotland was, by comparison, very poor. It was just the beginning of industrial revolution. And so the speculator helps to activate market efficiency and price stability. And now I've got my question. Where does that thesis really bear out in the book? Because this is the problem. Interesting as these things all are, especially chapter 5 and 6 tend to point towards the opposite. Because the speculators are selfish and have no interest in the common good at all. I mean, you can sort of try to find an excuse in some kind of edited version of The Invisible Hand by Adam Smith. I know this quote very well because I know Adam Smith very well, and it has also a religious Protestant root, this invisible hand. Actually started the first time actually in the movement of the planets. Adam Smith wrote a book on wrote a chapter on astronomy, would you believe it, as it was then, and he actually used that symbol or this kind of metaphor once. It is totally adapted in modern economics textbooks, taken out of context because it's in foreign trade and investment with a particular angle, and probably also ironic, in my opinion. And it is only half a page of a 900 pages book. But here we are. You could say, well, they don't care about anybody, about themselves, the speculators, but by accident, they do actually somehow, like an invisible hand, benefit the common good. Now, of course, the short selling market can ruin markets. And of course, the short sellers don't care as long as it works out for them. The creativity is only limited. It can also be a very criminal creativity as well. We shouldn't forget that. And so one should be quite careful with regulation. One shouldn't end up asking the criminal to write the criminal code. It is something, of course, over-regulation may kill off things, but one has to be careful whether certain things may not actually be killed off, and it would be for the better and probably really for the common good. And so it may be that speculation can be seen as rebellion and so on, and creativity, progress, financial innovation. But the stories, and so many very interesting ones in the book, don't simply sort of give you that straight away as an answer, as a buttressing or a support of this thesis generally, and especially chapters 5 and 6 rather point towards the opposite. It is a possibility, and I wouldn't want to do it, and I'm not so even sure whether I would be able to do it, if you actually take one case, the collapse of Lehman Brothers or one of these things, and go through that philosophical thesis on the basis of the facts, what really happened, in order to illustrate and prove that thesis better. I think that may be something. I wouldn't say that this is easy, and I'm not so sure whether I would be able to do it actually. But it is probably something which would be a further approach, because the idea to look at the speculator and not as an object, but a person with all its irrationalities, which Keynes also referred to already in his book, and shows that the irrationality in the share market is nowhere near anywhere, and things like that, and says that very clearly in 1936 already. But it is a good idea to look at the speculator as a person with all these flaws which human beings have, and not just as an object of regulation. But then the thesis in the examples what speculators did to us, one can actually illustrate that probably better, I think. And then there's also another thing, a certain hope in rationality. whether religious or not, is still here in the book, but in fact, it's kind of none at all. The CDOs are not rational at all. It's a belief system, as money itself is. We have given up on the belief system of the traditional religions, but we have replaced them by others. I mean, we actually believe that money has an intrinsic value, or we pretend to believe, and that's the reason why it works. And because nobody asked the CDOs when they actually were passed on what's actually in there with this sort of magic mathematics, it was believed that there is actually a value in it, but of course there isn't. And that aspect, of course, is also quite important probably to explain financial markets, and also the role and probably also the character of speculators. I think I can end here. I would recommend the book, whatever you think about it, it is a very good read. I have to say that.
Thank you, Andreas, and it's great that you enjoyed the book. I'm just wondering if Daniela wants to respond to Andreas' comments briefly before I address the Q&A that have come in.
Yes, I mean, briefly, thank you very much for your remarks. I think were very interesting, and also especially, it's true, in fact, the book is showing this, that actually, I mean, we cannot regulate the speculator in the sense that we cannot give a possible identification of what he thinks. But on the other hand, I agree that, I mean, financial regulation is essential, at least in objective terms, to put some limits. So in reality, I mean, because we can have evaluation of assets that is not a real or accurate evaluation, as we said, in many things, from CDOs to SPACs to every kind of financial innovation, has always this kind of problem on valuation. So at least the regulation, yes, can give some limits, but then there is also this irrationality in the market, and this irrationality is very psychological, I think, and it's something that probably we cannot really regulate. But if a person is more ethical, probably could take a right choice. I think it's more a question of being right or wrong. So how much risk I'm taking, at some point I need even to be right to take that risk, because I have a responsibility, while even the concept of responsibility, I think this is showing the book that uncertainty is coming just as a feature that you take as uncertainty, but in reality you don't take responsibility. So all the responsibility each time in that kind of financial crisis is shift to someone else, that at the end of the day maybe there were a lot of people that they ended up in the street in the financial crisis once they took that loans. So in reality is something very strange, that Wall Street was not punished in that moment. They just make money with more money, and people that they didn't have money, in reality, they were the one paying the price.
Thank you, Daniela. I have two questions here. I'll first address the question that's sent in by Professor Rosa Lestra. So Rosa, thank you very much for being here. Rosa says, well done, Daniela, and she enjoyed the presentation very much. The question is, drawing on historical experience and pondering on the creativity that's been mentioned by Andreas, would you be able to elaborate on the lessons for the current crypto craze, speculation? And what is the line that divides speculation and fraud? So this is a question that's also very close to my heart, in the sense that perhaps you can give us your views on whether you think the crypto financial sphere is actually just about speculation, or is it downright scams? And do you take the view that we should regulate it out or regulate it appropriately?
I think, yes, this is in fact one part of the book is also speaking about these cryptocurrencies. I think that essentially, I mean, we should, cryptocurrencies are not real currencies. So first of all, let's say are like a sort of crypto assets. So being crypto assets, there might be a long volatility up and down each time. So there is no stability in cryptocurrencies. What point that I think is that many cryptocurrency firms, like if we think about the crypto bank, they wanted to mimic traditional finance. So once I speak about traditional finance, I speak about a bank that is doing the business of a commercial bank, taking loans and then taking, deposit and then giving loans out. This is something that crypto firms, they tried to replicate. So they tried to replicate a system of traditional finance, but without having the rules of traditional finance and without even having the expertise, because traditional finance, I mean, in the book, I think is very clear, it is a business of over 2000 years, while cryptocurrencies is something very recent from 2009. So in reality, I don't think that they can tap this market. I think that there are things like, for example, if we think about stable coins, they can become, at some point, there was the case of Libra, Diem with Facebook. So that could be an hegemonic stable coin that has so many users that they might challenge maybe the stability of the dollar. But this time still is not here. And also it's not here because in reality, I mean, there are not still the right basis. Should we have a regulation? So should we extend maybe traditional regulation that we give to traditional finance to decentralized finance? I don't think so, because at some point we will in some way assimilate the two phenomenon. The two phenomena, in my view, they need to stay separate. But I think for a consumer protection, it's important to give rules to crypto, in the sense that we should avoid always the possibility of a next FTX. So this is what I believe, more on consumer protection, but less in giving or extending traditional use of traditional finance to crypto. Otherwise, also one day, they might also be able to access, I don't know, central bank money and lender of last resort facilities. So in reality, I mean, would be very close, the connection. One point probably is that if we think about JP Morgan, all these kind of investment banks, they are using blockchain. So we can learn from blockchain, we can use technology. I think this is important, for example, even in the pension scandal that there was in the past in the UK of the mini budget reform. If that asset were tokenized, for example, all the redemption could be met easily. So it is something that I think technology should be embraced, but we should also be able to separate who are the good actors from the bad actors.
Thank you, Daniela. I think you've just opened a large can of worms about how blockchain could have prevented the LDI crisis, but I think that might be a topic for another day. I would like to now address two other questions that have come in about the role of regulation. One is by my PhD student, Christianos. Thank you very much again for being here and for fielding a question for Daniela. He's interested in what you mean by regulating the subjective beliefs of the speculators. That you mentioned in chapter 4. So do you mind elaborating a little bit more, and how should regulators act on this, especially since this might be a very fine line in terms of, kind of promoting market healthy actions such as market making, versus curbing excesses. So where do you really draw the line? I think that's really interesting. The other question by Catherine Arias basically is about the role of ethics. So I think maybe you could take both questions together to look at the role of regulation and then to consider whether non-legal, norms, ethical values are themselves better, controlling sources in terms of working on financial market behavior. Over to you.
Yes, thanks. Very interesting questions. I think the point that I wanted to make in chapter 4 is that historically, if we think about, for example, Catholic Church, and so the fact that everyone that is Catholic, we go to confess, it's like that we don't take responsibility for our action. We ask just God to, forgive us. In the Protestant Reformation is different. So everyone can walk in the world and can take responsibility for its own action. Must take this because they don't have the confessional. So that is the point where I say that there is a rebellion of the man, where in some way there is a moment of change from Catholic Church, and also the moment where the people, they take risk, because if I cannot go to confess anymore, I will take responsibility for what I'm doing. So I think that in that moment, there was an historical part where In fact, if we think also the 17th centuries, the VOC in Amsterdam, that they cast away the Spanish domination by that time. So in reality, it was a moment of the golden age in Amsterdam after the Spanish domination, and is all in the name of Protestant. And so in reality, they are taking risk. The VOC, I think, is the symbol of this. It's taking risk and it's a new financial innovation. So without this kind of rebellion, there could not be this spirit to take risk. Once we take risk in chapter 4, I say that we need to elaborate, of course, and understand how much risk I'm going to take. So this is a very objective assessment. I will always calculate my risk, even Pascal, all the authors and the thinkers that also Andreas was mentioning. In reality, they gave us a possibility to calculate the risk. One point in risk is that what is important is to be accurate. In fact, if you think about an insurance company, you need to divide people in classes of insurance. And to do this, you need in reality to be accurate in calculating the risk. So calculation of the risk is key. On the other hand, there is another part that we said that is uncertainty. So uncertainty is the other part of risk that is not objective, it's subjective. It's subjective because essentially, first of all, we don't know uncertainty. We cannot prevent uncertainty. We cannot measure uncertainty. It's unmeasurable. And it's subjective because it's there that once a businessman is going to take risk, it's also the one that he has a specific instinct to believe that that investment will be profitable. So for example, if we think about an hedge fund manager, they are very peculiar individuals. They know the market, or at least they presume to know. Majority of time they know, and they know better than others. And that is what I mean with this uncertainty. I mean that there are people that they can dominate a little bit the uncertainty, but still with a subjective belief. So in reality, it's just the idea of that specific person that believes that that asset can create value, and then really creates and create a value for himself and for the investors. There are also other side of the coin that in reality, I mean, the things are going bad. So in fact, the other chapters are even showing these bubbles that when I take this risk, I face uncertainty, but then everything is going to collapse. So that is also the other side of the coin. In the book, you have both sides of the coin. And now in these two sides of the coin, we need to think about regulation. I think that today we have a regulation that is for sure on the risk side. So even if we think about banks, capital regulation, liquidity requirements are all objective rules. I need to follow that rules. And so in reality, I mean, it's something that is going to measure the risk. How much risk is going to take a bank, for example, if it's going to for example, invest in a risky asset. And I need to counterbalance this in capital and so on. But this is the only thing that regulation can do. What regulation cannot do is really to dominate that subjective intention of the speculator or the manager of a bank, for example. That is more difficult to be dominated because it's irrational and it's something that can even be sometimes profitable, but sometimes non-profitable. So this is what I meant by regulation that is not going to regulate this subjective intention or belief. Yes.
Thank you, Daniela. We are almost coming to the end of our time. I'll pass on the congratulations by Sir William Blair, who is also here. So Sir Bill, thank you very much for being here. So he congratulates you on an excellent book, and to Andreas too for your very stimulating discussion. One question for you, Daniela, is that do you think we are in a boom-bust cycle at present? I would certainly love your views on this and what you think might be the implications for financial regulation too going forward.
Thank you very much. I think essentially, I mean, the March Madness that is related to Silicon Valley Bank and all the other financial collapses in that moment, what is showing to us is that probably rules sometimes are not enough. So it's showing that in reality, a little bit, when I was even writing this book, essentially there was one financial crisis after the other. I started to have FTX, then there was SVB, and so on. And I think this book was even written in this kind of spirit that in reality, I mean, rules are not the last word. What is possible, and this was also to connect with Catherine that asked this question, ethics can help. But of course, Islamic finance is Islamic finance, we're not in Islamic finance. So this is also something that we need always to remember. Today, I think that, I mean, the inflationary movement are going less. So in reality, I mean, we are little by little see the light again. I think that the stock market, what even the book can show, is that never ends. So in reality, in the stock market, there are periods of euphoria, and then there are periods where everything goes bust, but still they are there. Still New York Stock Exchange is there, still London Stock Exchange is there. So I believe that essentially, I mean, there are cycles in every period of history, and the book is showing this in even 2000 years. In reality, it's taking a view of 2000 years, and it's showing that it's an old new portrait of this speculator, but still old. In some way, nothing changed. So as now we live maybe in a period of recession because of the war and many other problematics, we will still live a period of boom and then a period of recession again. If we want more stability, what I can say is this is the ethics that should come into finance. So ethics and finance, they should start to become more close to each other. Otherwise, we will always end up in having a system where essentially, if we have borrower and lenders, at the end of the day, the motto in corporate finance is higher the risk, higher the profit. So if we still believe in this, and because actually the book is showing that the history of risk and uncertainty is an history of centuries, it's very difficult to change that history. So for this reason, it's something that maybe more financial education can help, for example, more financial education, financial literacy for management, because this is also something that, I mean, can change in their behavior and in how they approach risk and they take uncertainty.
Thank you, Daniela. I think we'll squeeze in one more question from Louise Wallace-Slade, wondering whether blockchain or kind of open source and more transparency and accountability could be a way to moderate speculative behavior. That if everything is available, open for all to see in real time, do you think that could be an infrastructure that might moderate speculative behavior?
I think also that once you speak about blockchain, or even, I don't know, you can speak about open banking, what is important is even privacy. So, I mean, I think those are technologies that, as I said even before, we need to use technology, and I think we need to take advantage of technology, but we don't have to be the victims of technology in some way. So in reality, the same thing, I think we can see today, if we think about blockchain, it is a technology at the basis of a central bank digital money. So even there is different from the public blockchain, that is a private blockchain, but still we are using technology. But even there, one point is privacy, for example, how even personal bank accounts, they can be protected from interaction from the regulator or people that they can verify all your transaction in 1 second. I mean, I tried and I did open banking and I could have in 1 minute all my transactions in 1 year. And there could be even things that are private that you cannot avoid it. So still, I think the technology is not advanced. I think we need to work on the technology before entrusting a system on a different path, this for sure.
Right, thank you. And maybe technology might not do much to change some of the inherent biases in the human behavior either. Right, on that note, I think let's close the lunch webinar for today. We've had a very interesting, stimulating discussion and many good questions have come in. I'm afraid that we do not have time to answer all of them, but hopefully we'll continue to connect even offline. And those of you who have attended today and have questions for Daniela, I'm sure you'll be happy to receive them at your primary email address, which is available on his public profile. So thank you all again for being here. Thank you, Andreas, and thank you, Daniela, for your wonderful, stimulating discussions. And thank you, my wonderful audience, for all your questions, as well as for staying with us till the end. We still have quite a busy calendar of events coming up for the Centre, so please do keep a lookout for our events. Thank you all, and have a good rest of the day.